Hello, and welcome to our latest story from the Strongrooms. In January this year, we told the first part of the story of Hull's development through some of our most iconic documents, the charters. As promised, we'll now take the story on into the 19th century. We left off at the end of the 15th century, by which time Hull had become a prosperous port, a self-governing borough and a county of itself. It was governed by a self-perpetuating oligarchy of merchants, the mayor and bench of aldermen. Its citizens, the burgesses, had voting and trading privileges which had been granted and confirmed by successive kings of England. We're going to look first at two of the most turbulent centuries in English history, the 16th and 17th. These 200 years saw huge religious and social changes, successive rebellions and civil war, and economic decline. At the beginning of the 16th century, Hull suffered a period of recession. The mayor, aldermen and burgesses sought to mitigate the decline by seeking benefits from the king, the monstrous Henry VIII. The 1532 Charter of King Henry VIII gives us an example of the costs involved in getting a charter, as the accounts survive for the expenses incurred by one of the aldermen, Edward Madison, on his trip to London. The accounts take us into a world familiar from A Man for All Seasons or Wolf Hall. So, there were payments of £3, 6 shillings and 8 to the Bishop of Winchester, Stephen Gardiner, in his capacity as the King's Secretary, and another £8, 9 shillings in his capacity as Lord Chancellor for use of the Great Seal. 21 shillings to the Duke of Norfolk for the Privy Seal, fees to their clerks and secretaries, 2 shillings to the Clerk of the Green Wax for the Great Seal, 11 shillings and 8 to the clerk in Chancery Lane for showing Alderman Madison previous charters, the enrolled copies at the Rolls House, predecessor of the National Archives. Unofficial contacts were just as important as official ones, and influence has always been expensive. Thomas Cromwell, later Henry's most notorious minister, was given a purse of 20 gold angels, a gold coin worth 7 shillings and 6, together with a sturgeon. Small bribes were dispersed among doorkeepers to facilitate access to the great man. It all mounted up. Altogether, £31, 18 shillings and 6 was spent on obtaining the 1532 Charter. The Charter created a monopoly on trading in Hull for the burgesses. The great religious changes of Henry's reign, and in which the sturgeon-loving Thomas Cromwell was instrumental, affected Hull as everywhere else in England. With its two great churches, Holy Trinity and St Mary's, its 3 monasteries, 2 seen on this map of 1540, and a number of religious guilds, which were a sort of religious social club come friendly society, the port town was nonetheless influenced by European forms of Protestantism. During the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536, Hull surrendered to Roman Catholic rebels, but when a later attempt was made to capture the town in January 1537, the mayor and aldermen rallied to the king and captured the rebel leader. Hull's support for the reformed religion was rewarded by the Protestant child king Edward VI. This portrait is in his Charter of 1552, in which he granted to Hull the lordship of the manor of Myton, together with part of the dissolved monastery of the Charterhouse, and the fortifications which his father, Henry VIII, had built on the Holderness bank of the River Hull after his visit of 1541. When Edward's sister, Queen Mary I, came to the throne in 1553, her policy of restoring Roman Catholicism was probably less popular in Hull. However, when it came to obtaining the usual charter confirming previous grants from the new monarch, expense seems to have been no object. Alone of our charters, it is beautifully illuminated and includes this portrait of the Queen. The white pigment has darkened with time because of the lead content. We think the lavish decoration may be because the authorities in Hull were keen to prove their loyalty to the new regime, which had reason to doubt its loyalty. Persistent economic decline in the 16th century led to continued petitioning for help from the Crown. In 1577, Queen Elizabeth granted Hull a further charter in reward for the town's support during a rebellion in 1569 and to finance the repair of the harbour and fortifications. The charter tightened Hull merchants' control of all trade passing through the port. Outsiders could no longer sell goods to each other without a Hull merchant's involvement. These privileged men were permitted to combine as the Society of Merchants to police their monopoly. However, this resulted in a boycott of Hull ships by merchants in York. Hull took reprisals, and eventually the government had to intervene to prevent a local trade war. Hull was given special exemption from an Act of Parliament banning the import of salted fish, always an important element in its economy, and in 1598 Hull merchants were given permission to continue unloading cargoes at their own private wharves, rather than at a designated legal quay, where customs officials could keep a close eye on what was landed. We still see the legacy of this in Hull's Old Town at Wilberforce House. The merchant's house fronted the high street, and his garden led down to a wharf or staithe on the River Hull. Until 1774 and the creation of the first dock, since transformed into Queen's Gardens, Hull merchants had this unique privilege, which helped them avoid payment of customs duties. When King James I, first of the Stuart dynasty, succeeded his cousin Elizabeth in 1603, Hull, as usual when regimes changed, obtained a charter confirming its rights and privileges. In addition, being credibly informed that the town was suffering an economic downturn, James granted some additional benefits, including the right to levy a toll on all lead from Derbyshire passing through the port, and the ownership of the land called Trippet between the town walls and the Charterhouse. But despite centuries of royal generosity, Hull generally supported Parliament against the king during the 17th century, famously turning King Charles I away from Beverley-gate in 1642. After the monarchy was restored in 1660, Hull was subject to repeated attempts to control the town under Charles II and James II, although it wasn't alone in this. The restored Stuarts were suspicious of most urban centres of potential dissent. King Charles II granted a charter which was in effect a new constitution for Hull in 1661. This codified how the mayor, sheriff, aldermen and other officials were to be elected, how the various law courts were to work, confirmed the markets and fair, and reiterated arrangements for landing merchandise at the staithes along the River Hull. However, when James II, a Roman Catholic, succeeded his brother, and there was an armed revolt against him in the southwest of England, he attempted to remove all suspected supporters of the revolt from positions of power all over the country. In 1685, James issued a new charter which specifically excluded named Hull citizens from local government. By 1688, when James was trying to bring more fellow Roman Catholics into power and hoped to do so with the support of more extreme Protestants, the nonconformists, the position was reversed. A new charter was issued restoring some of the previously excluded aldermen. All of this was to no avail. On the 3rd of December 1688, Hull's Protestant population mounted a coup against James's garrison in support of the invading William of Orange, who soon became William III. The anniversary was long celebrated as Town-taking Day, and the statue of King Billy in Marketplace commemorates the occasion. The 1661 Charter of King Charles II was reconfirmed to provide the framework within which Hull was governed for 150 years, through the 18th and early 19th centuries. This was a period which saw huge changes to the town. Agricultural and industrial revolutions vastly increased the volume of trade passing through the port. The old harbour could no longer cope with increasing numbers of ships. The first dock, later Queen's Dock, now the site of Queen's Gardens, was opened in 1778 on the site of a length of walls that had first been authorised in the Charter of 1321. Other docks followed, and other industries grew up, such as oilseed milling, whaling, and ultimately the fishing industry. To deal with the issues presented by a growing population, with which the mayor and aldermen of the corporation were not constituted to deal, other local agencies had to be set up by Act of Parliament, such as the Schullcoats Improvement Commission of 1801. These problems mirrored similar issues in other towns and cities. Local governments set up by medieval charters could no longer cope with the urban expansion of the 19th century, and there was a greater expectation that more local people should have a say in the way their town was run. In Hull, activist and journalist James Ackland led a popular campaign against the mayor and aldermen. In his marketplace speeches, he championed a programme of civil disobedience against the corporation's tolls and levies on ferries, bridges and market stalls. In November 1831, during the Reform Bill crisis, he was a leader of the Hull Political Union, established to promote parliamentary reform. In 1832, he succeeded in opening the elections to Church Wardens of Holy Trinity and was himself elected at the top of the poll. At one point, he even ran his own Humber ferry to break the corporation monopoly. In 1835, the Great Municipal Corporations Act, passed by the reforming Whig government, introduced local councils much as we know them today. Charters were largely superseded and repealed. We began to move, as a town and a country, from oligarchy towards democracy. It was a decisive break from the medieval past, represented by the confirmation of rights and privileges by kings and queens. However, charters, more correctly called letters patent, continued to be granted by the sovereign of the day to confirm civic titles and offices. In 1897, to mark her Diamond Jubilee, Queen Victoria created Hull a city by letters patent, and the mayor was promoted to a Lord Mayor by King George V by a similar charter in 1914. For over 700 years, royal charters have underpinned the development of our city. Much of what they say has been superseded, but they still remain symbols of what it means to be citizens of Kingston upon Hull. The national commemorations of the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta in 2015 made much of that document being the foundation of human rights and the rule of law, even though much has changed and developed in those fields over the subsequent centuries. In the same way, Hull's own charters, beginning with this, the city's birth certificate of 1299, are worth commemorating as the foundation of much of the city's history. While the charters aren't on permanent display, you can visit the History Centre to see them in our search room. I hope you do. Until next time, thank you for listening and goodbye.